You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. We've all seen the pictures from Portland at this point. Somebody in a large inflatable frog standing face-to-face with law enforcement. An emergency naked bike ride protest filling the streets despite the rain. It can be easy to make jokes about the split realities of the Portlandia sketch that you could make out of those images and the scene that President Trump describes when he talks about the Rose City, a place, quote, where they kill people and destroy the city. But with an appeals court ruling this week clearing the way for Oregon National Guard troops to deploy to Portland, what are things like in the city right now, and what can we learn from the folks attempting to find common ground between the realities described by Portlanders and the dire tales spun by our president? Here to discuss is Anna Griffin, Pacific Northwest Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Anna, thank you very much for being here on KUOW.
Thanks so much for having me, Libby.
So you're based in Portland. You were previously with Oregon Public Broadcasting, our sister station, public radio newsroom. You know this town very well. Just to confirm, I mean, I don't mean to be too facetious about this, but is Portland currently on fire, destroyed, or in the midst of an insurrection from domestic terrorists, or any of those things happening?
Well, the sun is out, and we don't deal well with that. But in terms of literal burning, no, that is not happening right now.
What does the data show about how Portland's doing? I mean, is there like a ton of crime and disorder that would require the National Guard to be deployed here?
You're getting at sort of the cognitive dissonance that people here are feeling. 2020 in Portland, as in Seattle, was very rough. The pandemic took a huge toll on the economy here, which, unlike a lot of reasonably sized American cities, is really focused on smaller businesses, which get really hit hard first in something like the COVID-19 crisis. Also, we had months of protests centered downtown. And so we had a lot of graffiti downtown, vandalism downtown. Things have gotten markedly better since then. In the last year, especially, crime is down. There are still more vacant storefronts downtown than city leaders would like, but things are very back to normal. And I've lived in Portland 20 years, love the place. It is a very pleasant place to live. But we have, for the past 4 months, had some spicy protests down at the Immigration and Customs Enforcement building.
And when you say spicy, like what's been going on? And is this the kind of thing that local authorities, local police can't handle?
So for some context, the ICE facility in Portland is located in a neighborhood known as South Waterfront, which is about 2 miles from downtown. It is a neighborhood that has gone through a lot of urban renewal over the last 20, 30 years. So you have a mix of medical offices and taller condos and apartment buildings. The ICE building is sort of at one edge of the neighborhood, and it is really easy to get to. There's one road in and one road out. And since early June, when the president began his immigration crackdown, there has been a relatively small, some nights as few as a dozen people, some nights a couple hundred, who gather out there and protest. They hold signs, they dance in the street, and there is a group of them that will stand in front of the driveway into the building and its parking garage and block the driveway. The idea of being, if the federal government is going to deport people, they're going to put their bodies in front of that. Most of the time, what happens, and this occurs, probably a dozen times a day, people stand in front of the driveway, the garage gate opens up, federal officers in riot gear march out arm in arm, and they nudge folks aside. They walk out and the crowd disperses. Sometimes, especially late at night, especially on the weekends when the crowd is larger, there are folks who do not move, and federal officers will use pepper balls, they will use rubber bullets, they will sometimes use tear gas to get people to move out of the way. There have been arrests, there have been violent altercations between demonstrators and federal officers. That has been, particularly compared to 2020, exceedingly rare.
And so when we see images of these altercations that, again, there has to be some crowd dispersal or people arrested in front of the ICE building. Is it clear? Is this what Trump is talking about when he says that Portland, is under threat, basically is like a war zone, and that it needs the federal troops? Are these, again, rare, pretty limited, and it sounds like, something that's taken care of by the existing federal agents who are there? Is this what is prompting President Trump to want to send in the National Guard?
Let's be clear, this is not me expressing an editorial or political opinion.
Sure.
It is hard to know what the president is seeing because what he describes and the language that he uses, it does not match up with the day-to-day reality that the vast majority of people in Portland are experiencing. Now, having said that, what federal attorneys have argued in court, the state and the city have sued to try to block the federalization of National Guard troops here to help with the ICE building, is that what is happening behind the scenes is that 4 months of these protests have stretched resources, have exhausted, and in some cases, traumatized federal workers. And that is why they need the National Guard. So we've all paid a lot of attention to what the president has said. In their filings and in their arguments in front of federal district court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, federal attorneys say, don't listen so much to what the president is saying. Let us tell you what's happening behind the scenes.
Got it. So this is an incident where when you hear kind of these really dramatic statements about Portland as like a failed city under Democratic leadership, and that's, being spun by Trump as the justification for troops, that's belying what could be a valid cry for more resources from the ICE personnel. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think you explained that really well, that there are sort of two narratives right here. There is the one that the president and some top officials in his administration and a collection of right-wing streamers, provocateurs, they call themselves journalists, are putting out about Portland as a city just in chaos right now, which is fundamentally not true. And the reality that we're going on 4 months of protests, and the federal government only has so many people it can bring to bear on a daily basis through normal means. The political conversation and the legal conversation are different in that regard.
Anna, I'm so glad that we have you on to, walk us through all of this, because you have been covering the legal ins and outs of how this has been argued in federal court. So on Monday, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ruled that the president could send National Guard troops into Portland. We had been operating under this temporary restraining order, a couple of temporary restraining orders from Karen Immergut, a U.S. district judge who had blocked the deployment of both the troops from Oregon and troops from other states from coming in. Now, tell us what happened on Monday exactly, and what does it mean for the city of Portland?
Sure, it gets very complicated.
Yeah.
So on Monday, two members of a three-judge panel from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals essentially stayed the federal government's. The federal government requested that the judges stay Judge Immergut's first temporary restraining order, which covered the federalization of Oregon troops. In the course of a very chaotic weekend that we had here legally several weeks ago, the judge actually issued two temporary restraining orders. First, on a Saturday morning, the president announced, I'm sending in the Guard, and we were notified that 200 Oregon National Guard soldiers had been federalized and were being deployed. The city and the state sued. They got a temporary restraining order essentially saying, nope, you can't do it. This is all on hold pending the broader lawsuit. The same day that that order came out, the Department of Defense put 200 already federalized California National Guard members on a plane to Portland. And then the next day indicated that they were also considering sending Texas National Guard soldiers. So the city and the state rushed back to court. The judge issued a second temporary restraining order. This is where it gets complicated and a little weird. The federal lawyers only asked the Ninth Circuit to block basically the first temporary restraining order. And their logic was if the first temporary restraining order is invalid, then that should cover the second one as well, even though we're not filing a second set of paperwork.
And that's the one
The
for
two,
the Oregon troops
right,
specifically. Yeah.
right. So on Monday, the two judges, both Trump appointees, as is Judge Emmergut, on the Ninth Circuit, essentially sided with the federal government and said, yes, we agree that that first temporary restraining order, the only one you're asking us about, was made in error. And we believe the second temporary restraining order rises and or falls on the same logic. So they sent the whole thing back to Judge Emmergut, and the feds have essentially said to her, well, listen to what the judges are saying and lift both of them. She has scheduled a hearing for Friday to talk it all out, but we are in a place of real legal limbo right now. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, there's a process called, I'm going to get all Latin on you now, on bank. And what that essentially means is any judge on the Ninth Circuit who disagrees with a ruling that one of the smaller panels has given can call for a vote of all the judges on whether a larger group of judges should rehear the entire thing. So we're just right now sitting here twiddling our thumbs, anxiously awaiting all of this legal stuff to go down.
Wow. And is the question of whether these troops will be legally able to be deployed, is it hinging on whether or not the president has the authority to call them up, or whether the justification is sufficient? Does that question make sense, Anna?
Yeah. We're all going back to law school right now.
Please.
So
my parents will be so happy.
so, so essentially, the president has the power to federalize and deploy National Guard soldiers who usually report to each state's governor under three conditions: foreign invasion, an internal rebellion against the government, or when the situation in a place makes it impossible for him to execute the laws of the land without more resources. The federal government argued that the president, in their initial filing, argued that the president can prove right now both that there is a rebellion going on in Portland or the threat of a rebellion in Portland, and that current resources are not enough to execute the laws of the land, in this case, immigration enforcement. Judge Emmergut, in her initial ruling, right, pausing the deployment, said, "Yeah, this is nowhere near a rebellion, and you have not proven to me, even if you could, you haven't proven to me yet that you can't execute the laws of the land." The Ninth Circuit came back and said, "We're just going to take the issue of rebellion off the table right now, and we're going to say that yes, you have proven that you cannot execute the law without federalizing the Guard."
So right now we're waiting for Immergut's hearing on Friday to find out next steps if she's going to lift those restraining orders?
Two parallel tracks right now. We are waiting for Immergut's hearing on Friday. We are also waiting for the Ninth Circuit to vote and decide whether to have one of those on bank hearings as well.
Wow.
That would trump whatever Immergut does. And you remember there is a similar case going on right now in Chicago in the Seventh Circuit, and it looks like that may go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, because Trump's already deployed to Los Angeles, but there's also a challenge in federal court from Gavin Newsom about that. And then you had the deployment to D.C., but the Chicago one has been blocked. But as you say, might go up to the highest court. And if that occurs, if there is a ruling in Chicago with the Supreme Court, that's going to kind of clear the deck of all these other questions across the country, Anna, or what happens then?
Well, it very much is up to the Supreme Court because they, of course, have a huge amount of judicial leeway to decide how broadly or narrowly to make a decision. So they could argue, they could rule that what is happening in Chicago has no relevance on what happens in Oregon, or they could decide to come out with something that settles all of it. We just don't know.
Okay, so setting this aside really briefly, because there's still everything working its way through the courts here, There is something interesting happening in Portland at the city official level that you've also reported on. And that has to do with the way that officials have begun pushing back against Immigration and Customs Enforcement related to red tape and zoning, kind of like weapons that the city level folks and local officials have to counteract what's going on from the federal agencies. Like, what's going on here, Anna?
Local governments in particular have very few powers to regulate the federal government and prevent the federal government from doing its daily business, even when, as often happens in Portland and Seattle, local officials disagree politically with how, say, a Republican administration is doing things. The city of Portland has essentially filed a land use violation against the property owner of the building that ICE is leasing from a local developer. Way back in the early part of this century, while that neighborhood South Waterfront was being developed, property owner was going to lease what had been a vacant bank building to the federal government. People in the neighborhood, which was being renewed at that point, how apartments were being built, condos were being built. They argued that they were concerned that if ICE was detaining people in that facility, that they would release them late at night after buses have stopped running, and so you would have potentially criminals wandering the neighborhood. The city was really eager to lease vacant space to get tenants in this neighborhood that they were trying to turn around, especially this was right after the Great Recession. And the city essentially cut a deal with the property owner and said, okay, you can put detention cells in there, but they can't hold people overnight and they can't hold them longer than 12 hours, thinking that would sort of force the federal government to release people during daylight hours when buses were running. Well, there are researchers who study ICE facilities, right, who stand outside ICE facilities, who track who goes in and who goes out, because that is one of the only ways to track deportations in real time. The city of Portland has been FOIA-ing records in lawsuits, and they got some records earlier this summer that showed that ICE had been detaining people repeatedly more for longer periods than they were allowed. So they slapped a land use violation. And when they initially did it seemed like fairly toothless because even the fine in an extreme case is about $1,000 a month. But if something does go unrectified, the city council eventually serves as sort of a quasi judicial body and does have the power to revoke the conditional approval that lets the federal government detain people in that property. We have a lot of legal wrangling to take place between now and then, but it is giving city leaders something that they feel like they can do and satisfying what had been tremendous pressure from people on the far left in Portland to just do something. The
Wow.
rhetoric they use at their demonstrations is ICE out of Portland. No city government really has the power to do that, but they can use land use laws in a case like this to legislate real restrictions on what the federal government can do.
So the City Council of Portland could effectively evict ICE from that property.
Well, they couldn't evict them because it's a private lease with a private property owner. But what they could do is say, you no longer have the right to detain people there, which would make it much
Ah.
harder. There are only like 5 holding cells in that building versus the detention center in Tacoma, which I think has 1,500. But they do use it as a place that people sometimes go in, and when they come out, it is in a van being taken off for deportation proceedings. This would just make it harder on the federal government to do the day-to-day work of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration.
Wow. I'm talking with Anna Griffin, the Pacific Northwest bureau chief for the New York Times. Anna, I remember back in 2020 when the National Guard was deployed to Portland. Again, there were just much more widespread clashes with protesters and police and things. There was tear gas flying. There was a lot of activity, and the National Guard was out there. And Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler was actually tear gassed during those protests. I mean, it just seemed like those images were super viral, were, all over national news. It does feel, at least this time, And not when it comes to these land use, questions and things like that, but like in general, the local officials in Portland have been keeping their opposition a little bit quieter, like a little bit less confrontational than what happened in 2020. Am I assessing that correctly? I mean, has there been kind of a shift in their tactics and how they're confronting President Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The mayor of Portland, Keith Wilson, who was elected last fall, came to office essentially promising, I am going to focus on the basics. We are going to calm down the political rhetoric. We are going to really focus on jobs and public safety and how do we address the homeless crisis that Portland has in common with Seattle. And he told our friends at Oregon Public Broadcasting not long after he and Trump were both elected, you are not going to see us on Fox News. And he and Tina Kotek, the governor, they are both, they are much quieter elected officials than somebody like, say, Jay Inslee was in 2020s as Washington governor, or Ted Wheeler was as Portland's mayor. And they have been, it has felt like they've been going out of their way not to pick fights, knowing that the president and some on the right find a very easy target in Portland.
Yeah. And in Seattle, too, like you said. I mean, I feel that from 2020 on, Seattle became another symbol for the right to talk about, again, criticisms of Democratic-led cities writ large, and also to inflate problems that were going on for political purposes. So just a final thought here, Anna. What is next for Portland? Are people bracing for the potential legal system to crank towards allowing the National Guard into the city? And will that then potentially amp up counter protests? And we're talking about kind of a self-fulfilling cycle here. Like what's next for Portland?
I think you hit on the fear here, or one of two fears, maybe. Fear number one is the National Guard comes in, or the president brings in even more federal officers, which is what happened in 2020. It was not National Guard soldiers. It was U.S. Border Patrol, Customs Enforcement, U.S. Marshals. The federal force outside the ICE building gets larger, which then spurs much larger protests, right? We talked about tens of thousands of people protesting in 2020 and the lasting damage that did. The other fear, and in some ways, I think this is the more realistic one, and what we are seeing in other cities right now, Chicago being a great example, the federal government gets the right to bring in the National Guard to protect that building because in Oregon, as in Washington, local law enforcement and the National Guard are very limited in what they can and can't do, and they really can't get involved in immigration enforcement. But they use those resources to free up immigration enforcement officers to do more raids and do more work in neighborhoods and outside schools and in parts of the state with heavy immigrant populations.
Yeah. Anna Griffin, thank you so much for your reporting here, and we will be watching your latest out of the New York Times. Pacific Northwest Bureau Chief for the New York Times, Anna Griffin, thank you very much.
Thanks, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.